relationships, cycles, why our parents and families do some things of that nature, which are all generational cycles and things that we each experience.
There's no getting around the fact that bad things happen to people, things that are often outside of their control. And the psychological effects of wars, natural disasters, and other types of violence and accidents don't just go away when the war ends. They can leave people traumatized. Many people who are exposed to traumas like war get diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, where thoughts or anxieties about the events can plague them in other parts of their lives, and seemingly benign things can trigger a fear response. But hopefully once a war goes down in history and a few generations pass, we'll be free of the trauma, right? Unfortunately, it's not so simple. Trauma can affect future generations too. For example, in a study of 100 Holocaust survivors, researchers found that their children were more likely to get a PTSD diagnosis even though they didn't report any more traumatic experience in their lives than a similar control group did. What they did get was stories from their parents, really distressing stories. And hearing about threats to your family, even in the past, can be traumatic on its own. But that might not be the only explanation. Trauma could also be inherited biologically, sort of like what gets passed on through our genes. And since a big part of understanding people is knowing about the different factors that can affect their thought processes and behaviors, psychologists want to figure out how this works. So far, we do have some evidence that trauma can be passed biologically from one generation to the next, but it's very limited. A lot of it comes from a study published in 2015, where researchers did some genetic tests on a sample of 32 Holocaust survivors, 22 of their children, as well as a demographically similar control group. They were looking at what's known as methylation of the genes, where a DNA...
You good? Yeah. Yo, buddy, bro.
Molecule gets a sort of hop-on called a methyl group. If a gene has a lot of methyl groups attached to it, they can create problems with copying that gene, or it can keep the gene from doing what it's supposed to do. Studying methylation is part of the field of epigenetics, the study of what can be inherited or...
Everybody say epigenetics.
Epigenetics.
So this is like the base of this video. The whole video is pretty much about this, which means the study of what can be inherited or passed on from parent to child biologically. What that means is if my parents did it, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, aunts, uncle, that biologically those things have a chance or can in some cases be passed down to me. So if my great-grandfather was a war vet, he experienced PTSD, he has a hard time navigating society, certain things trigger him, those same things can be passed down to me biologically. Does that make sense? It's not in every case, but it does happen. So that's what epigenetics is.
Passed on from parent to child biologically, but outside of the actual letters of your DNA. Since methylation levels can change based on your environment, it's a way things that happen in your life can affect what we pass down. And researchers found that compared to the control groups, both the Holocaust survivors and their children had higher methylation levels in a gene related to stress response. Previous research showed that gene was related to an increased risk in developing a psychological disorder like PTSD in people who experienced some kind of trauma in their childhood. So the team thought they might have found a biological way for trauma to be inherited through increased methylation that gets passed on. But there are some problems with this study. Among other things, the sample size was pretty... There's no getting around...
Oh, no. Where were we at? What, do y'all know the number?
Genetics.
No, the number on here.
Nope. Genetics. Not the number, I forgot it.
I'll just go to like right here. What's up, Sean?
My mom said she wants to talk to you.
She here?
No, on the phone.
Oh, she's on the phone now?
No, not on my phone, but on your phone. She wants to call you.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. Benaja, you have my number, right? My personal number? Give Sean my personal number so he can get to the phone. What? Your hand raised too? Y'all good? All right, we're gonna continue the video.
generation to the next, but it's very limited. A lot of it comes from a study published in 2015, where researchers did some genetic tests on a sample of 32 Holocaust survivors, 22 of their children, as well as a demographically similar control group. They were looking at what's known as methylation of the genes, where a DNA molecule gets a sort of hop-on called a methyl group. If a gene has a lot of methyl groups attached to it, they can create problems with copying that gene, or it can keep the gene from doing what it's supposed to do. Studying methylation is part of the field of epigenetics, the study of what can be inherited or passed on from parent to child biologically, but outside of the actual letters of your DNA. Since methylation levels can change based on your environment, it's a way things that happen in your life can affect what we pass down. And the research...
It's a way that the things that happen in your life can affect what you pass down. So your environment, where you grow up, your household, your family members, what you do, all of that impacts what you, when y'all choose to have children, if y'all have kids, pass down. Your environment, what you grow up in, what you experience, how much stress, all of that impacts what you will pass down to your children. So it's a possibility you could pass something down to your children that grandpa did, or a response that your dad had, or your mother, because you all share the same DNA. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Making sure you guys are still with me so far. I know he's using a lot of like scientific words, but just hang in there.
Which has found that compared to the control groups, both the Holocaust survivors and their children had higher methylation levels in a gene related to stress response. Previous research showed that gene was related to an increased risk in developing a psychological disorder like PTSD in people who experienced some kind of trauma in their childhood. So the team thought they might have found a biological way for trauma to be inherited. Through increased methylation, it gets passed on. But there are some problems with this study. Among other things, the sample size was pretty small, and we'd have to look back a few more generations to see if the methylation changed when the trauma happened, or if it was always higher in that group. So the evidence so far is kind of tenuous, and we'll need a lot more research before we know for sure. That said, the idea that trauma can be inherited isn't too far-fetched. We know that other chronic stresses can have an effect on children, sometimes through a biological mechanism. But even if we never find a biological way to explain how parents who've experienced trauma can pass it on to their kids, there's a much simpler explanation that has a lot more research to back it up. Usually, parents shape a lot of the environment their kids grow up in, which can...
Parents shape a lot of the environments their kids grow up in, which can make a big difference when it comes to their mental health. So even if it's not biological, like within your DNA, within your systems, within your body, the fact that your parents have such a huge impact, your grandparents, wherever you live with, how you're raised, has such a huge impact on the environment, those things affect your mental health.
So like an abusive father, like he hits your mom, he hits on you, you could end up having kids and repeating the same problem.
Absolutely.
Hell,
Absolutely. We're not saying that that's what you're going to do if some of us experience that, but that's how it works.
it's just your reflection.
And here's the deal. Can you hit that switch for me, please, Mr. Price? And here's the deal. Like, some of us don't even know that we're responding in certain ways. You don't know that you're responding in an abusive manner, or why you have such a short temper. It's kind of just embedded in who you are from what has happened before. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't break out of those cycles and rearrange them, but some of us are born with some of those things because of what our past parents, grandparents, and family members went through. Does that make sense so far? Yeah. And then, like it just says, our environments and how we grow up impact our mental health. So if we grow up in highly stressful environments where we hear a bunch of yelling and screaming, if we hear our parents fighting, if we grow up in environments, they impact our mental health, which can impact what we give to our next generation. If we have sex, and then we have kids. Make sense? All of this is going to come together. We're almost done with this video. Any questions so far? Question? Jesus. I keep doing it.
Give me your water. Give me water.
Huh?
Give me water. Don't be your water first, Terry.
No, I'll tell you.
Give me water. Don't be one to Terry. Don't be your water. Come on, Terry.
All right, here we go. Bro, what in the world?
Covered alcohol. It's not just their shared genetics. The environment the child is living in can put them at increased risk. And if a parent experienced trauma, that can have a big effect on their kid's environment. For children of Holocaust survivors, for example, even hearing stories from their parents could change their view of the world. So we know there's a risk that's carried to children, even if the epigenetics idea turns out to be a fluke. But it's also important to remember that a risk factor isn't an equal sign. Having a parent that experienced trauma or had a clinical disorder doesn't mean you will too. Research shows that things like promoting positive parent-child interactions and teaching coping skills to children of depressed parents can reduce some of these risks. So even though kids are at risk of inheriting some negative consequences if their parents have experienced trauma, it is certainly not inevitable. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow Psych, and if you're interested in learning, there's no getting around the fact.
So, this is what I want you guys to do. So, raise your hand if you truly understood that. He used a lot of big words, but essentially what he was saying was, through epigenetics, we can biologically inherit certain traits and responses from our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-great-grandparents, based on what they went through. You got that part? Yes? No? Yes. Okay. He also said that based on the environments that we grow up in, that can impact what we end up passing on. So if we grow up in highly stressful environments or environments that are not positive, if we hear a bunch of negative words, if we hear cursing all the time, if we get yelled at, if we have to live in high stress environments, it's going to increase the chances that we pass on those things as well. But here's really what I want you guys to understand, and me and Mr. Price talked about this briefly before you guys got into this conversation last week, of how some of us voiced how we did not like some of the interactions, some of the way that we were raised, some things that we have experienced. However, not giving our family and whoever it is a pass, but understanding that those things do come from cycles, and that maybe they could not or don't know how to break free from what those things are that they are displaying. Does that make sense? So then we don't want you guys to do those things as well. That's really the main thing. That just because y'all went through it, just because you come from a traumatic environment, just because you may have experienced dysfunction, we want y'all to learn how to identify it, say this is what it is. I may come from a jacked up home. I may come from a problematic situation. I may come from unhealthy cycles, but I don't have to carry that on to my family. I don't have to carry that on my back to my kids. So we want y'all to start thinking about ways to switch it up so that your life can be better and not the same cycle over and over again. Do you guys understand that part? Are you sure? You're positive?